This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am Kevin Randle. Before we get started and I bring on my guest, Brian Dunning, I would like to say one thing. We keep talking about the book Roswell in the 21st Century. I have a companion book out now called Understanding Roswell, and I think the two books kind of go together so that you get a better perspective about what really happened in Roswell and how some things developed into storylines and how some things went astray. And I'm thinking specifically like the Glenn Dennis story of ordering the child-sized coffins and meeting the nurse, and how that story has kind of disintegrated with the investigations by UFO investigators and the skeptical community. I think the skeptical community looked at it and said, this story cannot be true, ergo it is not true. We in the UFO community actually embraced it in the beginning, but we also continued to investigate, finding things that Dennis was telling us that just simply weren't true. And I came to the conclusion 20 years ago that the Dennis story couldn't be validated, that it wasn't to be trusted. And that kind of detracts from the whole Roswell case. But that's outlined in both Roswell in the 21st Century and Understanding Roswell. So take a look at those two books as companion pieces. And if you're interested in a case I think is significant, take a look at Level Land, which is a book that came out not that long ago and looks at the Level Land sightings from 1957 in depth. I'm going to be joined here in just a moment with Brian Dunning, and he tells me that he is a science writer and author and also the executive director of Skeptoid Media. The site is mostly his gig. He has a press page there, and his personal site is there as well. You can also follow him on Twitter and all the other social media stuff too. He lives in Bend, Oregon, and can be found sometimes, he says, inside his Jeep or underneath it. And I'm not sure about the underneath it part. The website is skeptoid.com. That's skeptoid.com. Brian Dunning, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Thank you for having me. It's really good to be here, sir.
What caught my attention, what dragged me to you, was something I saw on the internet about the Belt, Montana sightings from 1967 that were sort of in the same time frame as the missile shutdown at Malmstrom Air Force Base, with some outside forces shut down the missiles. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about that. Now, I understand you have looked at the Belt, Montana sightings a little bit, but you didn't look at them in depth. And what was the reason for that?
Well, simply because it was so far away and a whole week apart. I just couldn't see any reason that they might have had anything to do with one another. You know, for there to be a UFO sighting a week from any other event, I mean, that's what happens every day, year round. So I don't see that a UFO sighting could have caused something that happened 100 miles away and a week earlier.
I think what we need to point out for those who may not be familiar with it is Malmstrom Air Force Base had a squadron of ICBMs, or a larger unit of ICBMs, but they're not located near the base itself. They're scattered all over the countryside, so that although you're assigned to Malmstrom Air Force Base, you might be, as you said, 100 miles or 200 miles away in a missile silo or a group of missiles as your duty station. So that's kind of where we get into the discrepancy. I was under the impression that some of the sightings took place closer to the events at Malmstrom, at the missile silos. There were a whole series of sightings I found kind of interesting. There was physical evidence left behind by at least one of the sightings, but you really didn't study any of that?
Well, no, I did. You know, what you're talking about is the reports of the one guy, Robert Salas, and virtually all of his colleagues said how old were these memories at the time? 20, 30 something years. his memories were simply wrong, that those things just didn't happen on the same time or the same place. And with the majority of people saying that it was wrong, the official report saying that the security guards who went around and checked everything said that he was wrong, I decided it's more likely that he was wrong than that he was the only person who was right out of all of these people.
Well, let me take a step back here, because I was talking specifically about the sightings in Belt, Montana, and there was a whole group of people who saw UFOs in that time frame, and by that time frame I mean the same month of 1967. Yeah. And there were some very good sightings, and those are I think outlined in the Project Blue Book files, as well as the Condon Committee looked at those sightings as well. And
yeah.
So when I was talking about some of the physical evidence, I was talking about some of the physical evidence left near Belt, Montana, as opposed to Malmstrom Air Force Base. Did you look at those sightings?
I didn't. I mean, that may well be, but we're talking about something that was a week after the incident at the Air Force Base. And so I just didn't see that this had anything to do with the story I was investigating, so I didn't bother.
Okay, let's get into that, because there's two separate flights that supposedly were shut down by some outside influence. You mentioned Robert Salas, who was involved in the second event, whom I've actually talked to. We did not hit it off.
I'm sorry to hear that. I've had that experience too.
He somewhat of a less than has not much of a sense of humor, I guess is the way I should put it. We shared a table in Roswell at some point, and I would be making jokes, and he got a little bit miffed at me and moved his stuff off somewhere else. So that was kind of funny. And then I saw him in Washington, D.C. later on. But there was one flight, I think it was an Oscar flight, that had the missile shut down.
The flight that had the missile shut down was Echo Flight.
Echo Flight,
and that's extensively documented. However, his memory is that, and apparently, I think we can accept that he was an officer in the launch control facility that was affected. His memory is that it was at Oscar, but all of the records and almost all of his colleagues say, "No, dude, you're remembering it wrong. You were at Echo when that happened." So I think the default is that he was actually at Echo and misremembering. I do believe he's honest. I'm not saying he's lying. I do believe he's completely honest in his in his recollections, just simply mistaken.
Well, I was going to say, my understanding from talking to him, and I could be in error here, was that there were events at two separate flights.
Yeah.
And one flight was completely shut down by some force that I don't think was adequately explained in the documentation I saw. They suggested some kind of an internal glitch, which supposedly isn't possible. What did you find in your investigation?
So my interpretation of why he says that there was these two events is that that's his way of rationalizing the way that his memory differs from everyone else's and from the official records.
Well, let me interrupt here. I don't mean
Sure.
to do it. I think you're misunderstanding me. I'm ignoring Robert Salas at the moment.
Okay.
There was a flight, missiles that were shut down.
Yes.
The entire flight went offline.
Yes.
My understanding was that there was a substantial investigation, which, because if that happens, it suggests some kind of force or somebody could adversely affect our retaliatory capabilities. So it becomes a matter of national security at that point.
Clearly.
And so there was a big investigation. My understanding was, based on what I saw in the Project Blue Book files and the Condon Committee report, was they did not come up with a satisfactory explanation of how that happened. Is that correct or not?
I would say the explanation was satisfactory that they came up with, but let me say how I went about investigating this. I first got the idea when I was watching the congressional hearings, in May, I believe it was, and they mentioned the fact that, hey, we now know that UFOs can shut down our nuclear arsenal. And I'm like, wait a minute, what is this? Because I hadn't heard of this before. And so I did a little bit of investigating, and I found Salas's book where he talks about what happened. And so I called a very good friend of mine who is a retired Air Force colonel, a lieutenant colonel, who was a missile officer. He was a Minuteman III missile officer. And I said, his name's Lieutenant Colonel Hal Bidlack. He did give me permission to mention his name. I said, Hal, tell me about this. What happened? And he said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I told him the little bit of the story about how it was at Malmstrom Air Force Base, 1967, and this happened. And he said, the missile officer community is a very small one, and it's a very tight one, and we all know each other, and we all know everything that's ever happened. If something like that had happened, I would absolutely know about it. Not even maybe, but absolutely. So I did some more digging. I dug up all of the facts, and I got the report from Boeing that did the technical inspection of the whole system that was affected. And I gave it to him, and we went through it together over the phone. And he was explaining everything and giving context for everything. And it seems quite clear that what happened was the local power station, Fergus Power, at their one of the substation that was closest to Echo Flight, they had a transformer blow, which, as we all know, that periodically happens at power stations. This one was particularly finicky. Yes.
Let me interrupt here because I'm going to have to take a break, and we're getting to the meat, so I don't want to interrupt you when we get to the good part of the story there.
Okay.
That sort of thing. We'll get into more about what happened here and what Robert Salas had to say about all of this in just a moment. My blog is at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and oftentimes I have additional information available on the blog that doesn't get presented in the program, and some additional information. And I looked at these sightings at Belt, Montana and Malmstrom Air Force Base in, I believe it was the government UFO files, or the government UFO file. So you can take a look at that. We will be back right after this with Brian Dunning talking about UFO shutting down missiles. So please stick around. And we are back. I'm joined by Brian Dunning. We're talking about the missile shuts down in Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, something that supposedly wasn't supposed to be able to happen. And you got involved with your friend who's a lieutenant colonel. Like you want to say, well, who isn't a lieutenant colonel, for crying out loud?
Right.
But it's kind of a joke there. So you were talking about, I guess, a power generator, a power station meltdown or glitch that affected this. So continue with that.
Yeah. So Fergus Electric Company, which is the municipal power supplier that supplied all of the launch facilities for Echo Flight, because that's the local area that they were in. They had a substation called the Winifred Substation. They had a transformer blow, and there's records for all of this. And the municipal power was down for several hours. But at the moment that transformer blew, it sent a power spike followed by an outage through the power lines. And when that hit the launch control facility, and just by way of background, you've got the launch control facility where the missile officers are located. And then I believe it's 2 nautical miles, don't quote me on that, nuclear blast radius apart, then you've got all of the missiles in the flight. So all of these, you've got 10 missiles, and you've got an 11th facility where the guys are located. Once this power spike hit where the guys were located, it sent a particular burst of noise through a particular data line, and that triggered all 10 missiles to go into an LF no-go state, which means that they are unable to deliver their ordnance onto their target for any of a million reasons. And what happens in that case, when they got this burst of noise through the data line, they simply restarted. And it takes between 10 to 40 seconds for the missiles to restart themselves, kind of rebooting like a computer, the 1967 version of that. So it is an absolute fact that for some 10 to 40 seconds, all 10 of these missiles were offline. But the cause isn't really a mystery. We know that this power spike happened, and we know which transformer it was at this particular substation. And I asked my friend, does this happen often? That gets into national security. He's very good about not answering questions that get into national security. Even though these were Minuteman IIs, and the Minuteman II is now a deprecated system, there's still facts about them that are classified. And all he would say is it's not unheard of. So missiles rebooting themselves for whatever reason was not unheard of. In fact, in Salas's book, he talks to a guy whose job it was to go around and manually restart missiles that had failed to do so for whatever reason they had gone down. So apparently this is not unheard of often enough that they need someone to be in charge of handling it. And that, as far as I could find, was the extent of the story. And now you've got a few decades later, Salas misremembering which flight he was working at. He thought it was Oscar, and it was Echo from all the documentation. So he rationalized in his mind, well, it must have happened twice then, because I know that I was working at Oscar when this happened. Nobody else agrees with that. The documentation does not agree with that. It happened at Echo. And there was this UFO sighting in Belt, Montana, a week after this happened. And just in his own memory from several decades, he just conflated all these things together and decided, okay, a UFO flew over and deactivated missiles at two of the flights. I think it's certainly the best explanation for all the bits and pieces of the story, where almost all of the evidence that anything out of the ordinary is coming from one guy's memory.
Wasn't there a number of Air Force personnel, not Robert Salas, but other Air Force personnel, those at the launch control facility and the security police, who had UFO sightings at that time, in that time frame? Let's put it that way.
So that depends on who you ask. The documentation, I mean, they have it. Shut that thing off to do not disturb. I forgot to do that. The documentation that is in the Air Force report is rumors of unidentified flying objects around the area of Echo flight during the time of fault were disproven. A mobile strike team, which had checked all of November flight's launch facilities on the morning of 16 March 1967, were questioned and stated that no unusual activity or sightings were observed. Now, some of the people who worked there, the Belt sightings were in the newspaper. I mean, people were talking about it, so they're going to remember it. And it's entirely reasonable that, I mean, who remembers the date that you heard a UFO report? So it's entirely reasonable that some people may have said, hey, this might have happened on the same date, especially because this guy Salas is claiming so in his book.
Well, the Condon Committee sent an investigator to Malmstrom Air Force Base to talk about the UFO sightings there. And is it Lewis Chase or Chase Lewis? I forget who it was, who happens to be a lieutenant colonel at the time, another lieutenant colonel in the story, was questioned about that. And the investigator from Condon said, well, we've heard there was a missile shutdown. And he said, I can't go into that. It's a matter of national security.
Sure.
So
As
we
it
have,
is.
yeah, absolutely. So we have
UFOs notwithstanding, missiles shutting down is a matter of national security.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially an outside force doing it. Because the last thing you would want our competitors to know is there is a possibility of shutting out the missile flights from outside the launch control facilities. So he wouldn't talk, Lewis wouldn't talk about the sightings. Chase wouldn't talk about the sightings, the missile shutdown, but he did talk about the sightings. So you're suggesting that these two were, although they're located in a same general area in the same general time frame, they're really not connected by anything else.
I couldn't find any reason to connect them. I mean, if for some reason, let's say that we had data, some kind of evidence that UFOs cause missiles to shut down. Let's say that was a known characteristic of UFOs. If the UFOs had been sighted before this happened, well, then maybe you'd have something to talk about, but they didn't. They happened a week after all of this. A week after the missiles rebooted themselves and were back in normal state. And the missiles did not go down again when the UFOs happened. So the UFOs were absolutely not connected to these missiles rebooting themselves.
Robert Hastings, and I don't know if you came across his name in your research,
yeah,
did a book called UFOs and Nukes, and talked to a number of missileers, I think they call themselves, about this happening at other locations. And the one that struck me was a fellow at Warren Air Force Base, which is in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And the only reason I know that was because I was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and my grandparents lived about 2 blocks from the front gate. So I'm familiar with Warren Air Force Base, which was, by the way, a cavalry post in the 19th century.
Very fun.
And the thing that we remember in the museum, there were signs that they had been posted in the buildings that said, "Do not shoot buffalo out barracks windows." So kind of moves it into that. But now it's a missile site. But he talked to a number of missileers, and as I said, one guy at Cheyenne that talked about some of this happening periodically with other UFO sightings. Did you look at any of that sort of thing, or did you just focus on the ones there in Montana?
I tried to. I couldn't find any. I'm aware that Robert Hastings mentioned them in his book, UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapons Sites. That was the only source that I was able to find.
You didn't talk to any of the missileers then?
I just talked to my one guy who,
okay,
he said if anything had happened anywhere, they would all know about it. I mean, you're talking about a very small fraternity.
There are a number of interviews in his book from people, and I've actually talked to a couple of the guys who were involved in some of these UFO sightings and around missile silos. And I'm not sure that they were talking about it shutting things down, but sightings co-located with missile silos and that sort of thing. But I'm not sure that's a great connection to draw there.
Yeah, I mean, like we said at the top of the show, people see UFOs all the time, and things happen all the time. And the idea that you are required to draw some kind of a causative connection, I don't think is one that can be supported very well. I do want to say, I'm sorry, but I want to give Robert Salas some credit. In his book, he did include all of the affidavits that he asked his colleagues to write, and even the ones that vehemently disagreed with him, he included them in his book. And I think he deserves credit for including the opposing viewpoint.
Salas, from my conversation with, I'm trying to phrase this logically. Salas suggested that in his flight, not all of the missiles were shut down, just part of them. Or he believes they all were, but his the commander in the silo, thought it was only part of them. Did you talk to Salas about this, or did you just go from the documentation?
No, I was going from the documentation, and that is a point that's unclear, how many of the missiles in the flight were affected. At one point in Boeing's report, it did say that all 10, and I feel that's probably the most reliable.
Okay.
So I'm going with all 10, but I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I guess the thing that is confusing me is there was one flight, let's say, with all missiles were shut down. Salas, I thought, was talking about another flight in which a similar event happened in the days following the first event, and it may have shut down part of the missiles or all of the missiles in that flight as well. And is there two separate events like that you're aware of, or is it just a single event? I think the Air Force documentation just talks about the single event.
Yeah, I mean, that's mostly from the Freedom of Information Act response. I'm not sure who filed that or when, but that's the best collection of all the information. I know in his book he talks about there having been another incident, but again, from talking to my friend and from I believe there was an affidavit from this guy whose job was to go around and restart missiles that had shut themselves down. In Hal's terminology, this was not unheard of. So I think we can say, yes, of course, other missiles had shut down for one reason or another. That's just seems to be the normal course of business. Okay,
well, let's move on from there. I'm going to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about something else maybe. Your website is skeptoid.com. You can find more information about that, this information and other sightings at that site. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. And we are back. I'm here with Brian Dunning. We were talking about the missile shutdowns at Malmstrom Air Force Base and Belt, Montana sightings. I think we pretty well eliminated that case here. I think that the sightings at Belt might be very interesting, might have a great deal to do with UFOs, and I'll post a little bit more about that to my blog for those who are interested in it. But from his point of view, and I think probably a logical point of view that the missile shutdown had little to do with the UFO sightings. But you had mentioned you were interested in cattle mutilations. I saw something on your website that suggested an interest in cattle mutilations. So tell me a little bit about what you've done there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a science writer. I work for a nonprofit, and it's something different every week. So I've covered just about anything and everything. So yeah, cattle mutilation is in that mix somewhere. Well, I got a call from a reporter from our local newspaper here, who told me that out in a town probably 30, 40 miles away, there's been a rash of cattle mutilations. And the sheriff out there was convinced that it was Satan worshipers were responsible for this. And so he wrote up a paper for the judge in support of trying to get himself a search warrant, allowing him to have access to the cell phone location data of literally anyone that they suspect of having been connected to these cattle mutilations. Now, from a constitutional law standpoint, that is ridiculously extreme overreach.
I was going to say it is very frightening that you could have something that vague. I want anybody's cell phone that I want to check because they might be involved.
Anyone who I think I suspect, or I say I suspect. And the search warrant was granted. Now, I haven't heard back from my friend to say here what repercussions there may have been about that. But to me, that was a very graphic illustration of how misinformation or I don't mean this to have a negative connotation, but ignorance can be misused and abused. A little bit of science literacy would do everyone a big favor, especially this particular sheriff. We had presented to him information on how and why cattle mutilation happens naturally as a result of bird and insect predation literally within just a few hours of the cow dropping dead. And he was basically had no interest in that at all. In his mind, it was Satan worshipers, and that was the end of it.
Well, let me interrupt here because I know there was a case in Arkansas in 1976, 1978 timeframe where they had come across a recently deceased cow, and they watched it for 24 hours or 48 hours or 2 days, watched it for 2 days. And what they saw was the sort of things that you got in a mutilation were the result of, as you said, the natural predation, the insects, the birds, the small scavengers getting at the soft tissues and that sort of thing. And there was a picture that they showed, and I always laughed at it. I said, well, we were there at this cow and there were no footprints around it. We don't understand how you could say it was predators. And I think, did you see the bird droppings all over the cow?
Yeah.
But so what I'm saying there, that kind of information, I think, should have made an impression on the sheriff if that was presented to him, that another sheriff had done this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that information has made an impression on some sheriffs, but you know, we all have our blind spots, you and me included. I always try to remember that some of the things that I believe are wrong, and some of the things that you believe are wrong. And I think everyone would do themselves a favor by accepting that fact and trying to actively seek out what those are so we can fix them. And this is something that this particular sheriff just had in his mind, that the cause of cattle mutilation is Satan worshipers. End of story. So he was not at all interested in, whatever those damn scientists have to say with their pocket protectors. I would
point out that back when I was invited into the investigation, which would be 1976, I believe, Jim Lorenzen from April had called me and said there were some cattle mutilations up in Minnesota. And would I go look at those? And I said, sure. Well, I didn't want to look at the mutilations, but would I go investigate? And I said, sure. And at the time, the idea was it was Satan worshipers doing. I think there was a guy named Don Flickinger, who was a member of the ATF, which is now something different because we have to change the acronyms periodically to keep the public guessing. But had talked to an inmate, was talking about the Satan worshipers. But when we got up there, and I say we, Bob Cornett and I went up there and talked to a number of people. We talked to the farmers, we talked to the news media and all that. And the idea that it was some kind of satanic worship just didn't pan out. And from that point on, I saw Ken Rommel's report. I'm not sure you're familiar with that. Ken Rommel was a retired FBI agent who was hired by the state of New Mexico to look into cattle mutilations in the late 1970s, that time frame. And his conclusion was scavengers and predators who were responsible for the mutilations. And his report is like 297 pages long. He actually sent me a copy of it, which I thought was kind of nice of him, because I called him to talk to him. I said, well, give me your address and I'll send you a copy, which he did. So I've been of the opinion since that point that there is nothing mysterious about the cattle mutilations other than the phenomenon that's been built up around it. And I'm surprised that it's still going on the way it is. I think Tucker Carlson has now done his best to enliven that situation with his documentary, which I refuse to pay for the firewall or the paywall to see his documentary.
I mean, it helps you understand why this sheriff, though, if Tucker Carlson is promoting it today, that's demographically probably exactly where this particular sheriff comes from. This is Eastern Oregon, after all. It's interesting that you mentioned this happened in the 1970s, because that was the height of the Satanic Panic, which was a major cultural trend, when there was this wave of belief that swept over the nation that there was such a thing as Satan worshipers. And there never really was. I mean, there's little churches of Satan and so forth, but they're mostly satirical, just excuses for people who are non-religious to do charitable stuff. But this whole thing with, you remember stories of babies being skinned and being roasted alive and things like this. This was all part of the Satanic Panic. None of that ever happened. And yet it became a major cultural trend. And it drove in part things like this, the cattle mutilation.
I'm not sure that the idea that it drove the cattle mutilation, I think the cattle mutilations were actually beginning prior to the Satanic Panic sweeping the country. But yeah, they were in the same time frame.
I meant it drove that explanation for the cattle mutilations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was told by somebody once, if you take a private plane up on the Satanic holidays, you'll see the bonfires all over the countryside where the Satanic worshipers are.
Yeah.
But I was never able to find them. I think there probably are some people who take it very seriously, but it's a very small number of people, and they're not out there mutilating cattle.
Yeah, you can come up with just about anything, and somewhere in the world there's a very small group of people who take it very seriously. But by and large, if you find a Satan worshiper, it's going to be for some satirical Church of Satan or whatever, and is very harmless.
What sort of evidence did the sheriff have that he thought proved it was satanic worshipers?
Let's see. I have the letter that he wrote to the judge in support of this warrant, and he gave some of that. And what he was talking about was basically stories from the internet. He was copying and pasting stories from the internet about satanic ritual abuse and things like this, and other cases where people had believed Satan worshipers were behind cattle mutilation. He did not present any evidence from any of the locations at the site. He didn't say, oh, we found a bloody crucifix or something at this site. It was all just basically internet stories that this guy has clearly taken to heart. It swayed the judge.
Well, I was going to say, I'm concerned about this judge here. What is his background very impressive, or is it like some places where you elect the judges and they don't really have to have a law degree?
I don't know anything about this judge, so it would be pure speculation.
Obviously, the sheriff went out and looked at some of the dead cows.
Yeah, they did, and they had some pictures, and the pictures were exactly like what we've seen before. The soft tissues, the anus, the lips, the eyes were the first to go. I think one of them showed a slice on the abdomen, and you know how as the skin dries and it pulls tight, any little hole will get stretched out into a very sharp-edged slice. And for anything, it does look like someone took a scalpel and made this very precise incision, because the edges look perfect, and that's just a factor of the way the skin dries and pulls back tight. And so his pictures are compelling. If you don't know anything about this, and maybe the judge is one of those people, and here's someone showing you these very weird pictures that look like, man, you can only imagine a scalpel must have done that. And he says, here's all these stories from the internet that satanic worshipers are doing this to cows. It's not that far-fetched to suspect, oh, maybe this judge was, he felt that was compelling enough because he didn't have any better ideas.
Well, again,
going back to a bit of science literacy will do everyone some good.
I am more concerned about the judge granting this really vague search warrant than being overwhelmed by this evidence, or the supposed evidence, I should say. So, but on the sites of the mutilations, were all the cows grouped together, or was it cows over a wide range, wide range area?
I remember one picture clearly enough to tell you what was in the background, and there were no other cows visible. I couldn't really tell you anything else about the location or where it was found, except that it was on a cattle ranch.
Well, we're going to have to take another break here. And I think it's a good place to take a break here because we're talking about cows, cow anuses. And I think I've always wondered if cow anus was a delicacy on another planet. And that was why the UFOs always got that part of it. Anyway, the website, again, is skeptoid.com. I don't know why I have to keep looking at my paper because I should be able to remember that. Mine is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I'm going to have a couple of pieces about cattle mutilations up there in the next couple of days, which is not going to throw my friend Chris O'Brien about that. But there's some interesting things going on there. As I say, I think we're on agreement on this, that there's more of a natural explanation for this than there is some kind of mysterious thing going on there. We will be back right after this, so please stick around.
All right.
And we are back. We're talking about cattle mutilations, unfortunately. I thought I'd mention to you that one of the things I looked into was a report from Dubuque, Iowa, where a bunch of cattle had been killed by a gas grenade and then mutilated, which on the surface is kind of frightening, that somebody's got a gas grenade like that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that case is an outlier.
Well, but the cows died of blackleg, so. And I talked to a vet in Wisconsin. I always remembered his name was Jefferson Davis. I thought that's a weird name for a guy in Wisconsin. But he was talking about another aspect of this that shows there are real mutilations going on. He was approached by a farmer who he worked with, a dairy farmer, and said that his cow had been mutilated and the ear had been cut off and things like that. But what the vet said to me was the cow had been sickly from birth, and had the cow died of natural causes, the farmer got no insurance money. But if the mutilators got it, then the insurance paid off. So there was a financial component to that one. But what made it worse is some guy showed up with a big van that said UFO investigator on the side. He says, every time we get a UFO sighting now, we get a cattle mutilation.
Yeah.
And the other thing, the thing about you saying about science, and I wanted to mention this, is one person challenged me, said, well, how do you explain the lack of copper in the blood of some of the animals? And I thought, well, that's a darn good question. How do I explain that? And unlike your sheriff pal, I went onto the internet and I found a bunch of science journals and explained exactly why there'd be a lack of copper in the blood of cattle. And in some locations, I think Utah springs to my mind, they feed copper supplements to the cattle so that they have the proper amount of copper in their blood. So even these anomalous findings, you might say, are not that anomalous at all. They take care of that. Was there any sort of necropsy performed on the cattle that you are aware of, or was it just the sheriff's observations?
Yes, there had been. The vet determined that the cow had died of natural causes. I believe it was as simple as that. I don't think they were able to say. I mean, sometimes they just die. I guess there was no specific. There was no wounds that had caused its death. It had just died of natural causes. And it may be that that's as far as they leave it. If there was any toxicology done, it was not reported.
Well, I was going to say a snake bite might have done something. I don't know what the prevalence of rattlesnakes in Oregon is. But I know that's a problem in like New Mexico and some of those areas.
They're here for sure, yeah.
But
without it being reported, I just don't know.
So your study of the cattle mutilations wasn't quite as in depth as mine, apparently.
No, I mean, I've got a weekly show, so I've got a week to spend on each subject. I'm not able to go into the depth that I would like to. I mean, every time I do a show, it's like, my God, this was fascinating. This was so much fun. I wish I could spend a year and make a whole documentary film on just this. But no, I've got to do something next week.
What topics do you explore on there? I'm sure it's not just related to the paranormal and UFOs and that sort of thing. What other topics do you get into?
Well, we're an educational nonprofit, and our mission statement is to promote science literacy and critical thinking. So what we look for are fun things in pop culture that everyone would like to hear about because it's an interesting subject. And ideally, we're looking for something where a lot of people believe something that's not true, but when you dig into it, you find a lot more interesting true history or true science behind it. So everyone comes away with a positive lesson going, hey, that was neat. So this can include anything from conspiracy theories, we do that a lot, paranormal claims, alternative medicine schemes, urban legends, pretty much the whole gamut. You know, if a lot of my friends who are science writers and science communicators and working research scientists as well, we all got our start by buying all the ghost books, all the Bigfoot books, all the UFO books, and believing every word that was in them. And just being so fascinated with the subject that as you get older, you decide you want to find out, hey, what was really going on here? I'd really like to know. And so that's how I got into doing what I do. Finding the real solutions is, for me, so much more rewarding than just stopping at the version that they want to tell you on the History Channel and say, aliens built the pyramids, that's all there is to it. No debate allowed.
Well, what's your feeling about NASA now looking into the UFO phenomenon? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's a bad idea because it's giving oxygen to an idea that I don't think deserves any. And I say this from I should say that I'm in the middle of producing a feature documentary about the UFO phenomenon right now, and the position that we're taking is that we're talking about the true science behind physics and exobiology and everything else, that whatever your position is on UFOs, this movie will help you bolster that with some good science. So it's not a movie that takes a position per se, one way or the other. I think we can say for sure, though, that we do not have any reasonable evidence that Earth has been visited by extraterrestrials. We've got a ton of very bad evidence, but no really good evidence.
What would you consider good evidence in the few minutes we have left?
Yeah, I mean, this has been talked about a lot. It's like if you had a chunk of metal that was isotopically so improbable on Earth. A friend of mine who was a calibration scientist for the Hubble Space Telescope, they had a little chunk of, I want to say palladium, but that's probably wrong. It cost them $100,000 to get this one because it had to be isotopically pure. So at some point, if you're going to provide a piece of metal that's too improbable to be to exist on Earth because of its isotopic makeup, that's going to cost you millions of dollars potentially to make that. And so we're not going to see that hoaxed, very likely. I mean, that's the kind of thing. But then we've got other things like radio signals, like the WOW signal still remains. Its best explanation is a radio signal from a point in space in the direction of that particular constellation that it came from. And everything else is pretty much eliminated. There's a lot of very interesting stuff to talk about. There's a lot of very fascinating things happening in the world of astrobiology right now. With James Webb Space Telescope is probably not quite able to resolve the atmospheres of exoplanets to see what kind of life exists on them. But the next generation of space telescopes absolutely will have that resolution. And so
what about Avi Loeb and his Project Galileo? You familiar with that, I'm sure.
Yes, I am. I think he is also someone who's not doing any good. He's taking a very fringe perspective and he's giving it all of the trappings of legitimate science. And I think he's fooling a lot of people into thinking that this is, not so much a fringe perspective. So I don't think he's doing any good.
I think of things like the Level Land sightings, and I'm I'm pretty sure you're not that familiar with them.
No.
It was an event that took place in November of 1957. I bring them up on the program periodically because I think it's a very important sighting, and we're going to run out of time here. People at 13 separate locations that we can document, probably many more, including the sheriff, including Air Force officers, witnessed this object as it approached their cars. It stalled the engines. It dimmed the headlights, which may be a result of stopping the engines, filled the radios with static, left landing traces on the ground, independently reported throughout the area over a period of about 3 hours in Levelland, Texas. And I think that would be the kind of sighting that would have demanded at the time a better investigation than it got. And I think that might be something that if it had happened today, we might have gotten a better understanding of some of the UFO phenomenon. And I know it's not fair to ask you, well, what do you think about that without having all the facts in front of you other than my very brief description of it? But wouldn't that be something interesting to look at?
You're right. If that had happened today, everyone there would have had their cell phone recording it, and we'd have quite a bit of actual evidence of what happened. And in so many of these cases, you study interrogation techniques, and when something happens and there's multiple witnesses, what's the very first thing the police do is they separate everyone, put them in different rooms, interview them individually so that their stories can't cross-contaminate and influence one another. And so many of these stories like this, where we basically have an anecdote that's decades old, and a bunch of people all saying more or less the same thing. And the only thing we know is that the evidence was not collected properly, there's probably no way to ever find out what actually did take place because the eyewitness accounts were hopelessly contaminated.
I would say that there was no opportunity for a lot of the witnesses to be contaminated given it was 1957 and it wasn't on their cell phones. It wasn't over the news media right away. And although it wasn't a proper interrogation, there were questions being asked of the witnesses they called into the sheriff's office. So they were getting the stories from independent witnesses who had no opportunity to see what other people had said. So I think that's what makes it an important sighting.
I would love to learn more about that. I mean, a lot of when you ask me my first reaction to something that I'm hearing for the first time, I'm going on the experience of having looked at so many stories and so many commonalities that we find time and time again in these stories. And that's one of them.
Well, and that's the thing. I understand that you have absolutely no knowledge of this case, and I bring it up periodically to fool skeptics, I suppose. I don't know. I did a book called Levelland where I explored this thing in depth. And the Air Force didn't have a proper investigation, for one thing, and they didn't have a proper answer for it. It should have been labeled unidentified as opposed to ball lightning. And we could argue about the reality of ball lightning if we wanted to, but it didn't seem like that would be a legitimate explanation for a series of sightings that took place over a period of 2.5 to 3 hours in various locations around Levelland and Lubbock, Texas, 1957.
Very cool. I'll look forward to hearing about that one.
The book's available on Amazon.
All right.
Sorry about the commercial there. Brian Dunning, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us today. I think it's a very fascinating discussion, and I appreciate your points of view on many of these sorts of things. I'm going to look a little bit more into the Belt, Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base sightings and check that out a little bit deeper. But thank you much for that. As I say, the website is skeptoid.com, and you said you had a podcast or a radio show?
Yeah, the podcast is skeptoid.com, and the movie I'm working on, you'll find it at theufo.movie. You can watch the trailer for it and all of that stuff.
Well, thank you very much for taking your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been great talking with you.
All right. Next week, I'm going to be talking to John Greenwald. We're going to be looking at the Hoddle memo that he just got the unredacted version of, which is a UFO landing in a series of UFO landings or UFO crashes, I suppose, that sort of thing. And in coming weeks, I'm going to talk in depth about cattle mutilations, and Tom Carey will be coming back to talk a little bit more about his experiences in the Roswell case and UFO investigation. Hey, thanks for tuning in and taking a look at us. If you get a chance, take a look at Levelland, take a look at Understanding Roswell, and I'll be back in 167 hours. Thank you.